can you start with your name, your graduating class, when you joined as a faculty, and what your current positions are?
Tim Lear, class of 1992, joined the Pingree faculty in 2007 and currently serve as the Director of College Counseling.
Coach Lear is also one of the cross-country coaches. What was it like being a student at Pingree?
I loved it, although I should say I loved it eventually. So I arrived in 7th grade, which is when middle school started then, with my twin brother, and kind of felt we didn't want to come. We felt like we were losing our friends in Summit, who were all going on to the middle school in Summit. And I remember getting kind of grief from them and even from some of their parents about leaving the Summit school system to go to a private school. And so we came very reluctantly, did poorly academically, partly on purpose, because we had made a deal with our parents that if we didn't like it or do well, they would let us rejoin our friends at Summit in 8th grade, which they had no intention of doing. We didn't realize that. But by kind of 8th grade or so, 9th grade, started to get our footing academically. It definitely was a faster pace than I was accustomed to. And I went to a great grammar school in Summit, but showed up and was unprepared for the pace, for the kind of organizational skills that I needed. And for me, I guess what gave me a firmer footing and allowed me to start to develop a sense of confidence and some friends was sports. So I started running cross country, spring track, and did well. And so that gave me a kind of an identity and a peer group that I could kind of build off of. The academic part came really kind of 2 to 3 years later. It wasn't until freshman, sophomore year that I really started to do well and kind of get the same sense of satisfaction that I got right away from running.
What do you think are some of the differences between being a Pingree student back then and maybe now?
I think back then there wasn't as much of an emphasis on kind of the arts. So I think you either were an athlete or not. And I think the or not group kind of did music on their own. So we actually had a really robust kind of almost underground music scene. And Adam Gardner, who was recognized last week with the achievement in the arts, I remember distinctly his group and the people that he referenced, the older students. I remember them playing almost weekly in morning meetings. So the student bands had kind of an identity within the school. So because I feel like the arts community had to kind of organize itself somehow. The athletic community I felt was in some ways kind of separate from the rest of the student body, so not in really a good way. I do think we had more kind of 2 and 3 sport athletes, so club sports weren't big. So in some ways you could interact with a broader cross-section of the student body than some of our athletes do now. If they just do one sport and then they're doing it primarily as a club athlete, I feel like that pulls you out of the community more so. But I think the growth in the arts has just meant a whole new kind of student is considering Pingree, and a whole new side of students is allowed to kind of come out and express itself. Academically, it was always a pretty rigorous place. I think there's the idea that it's such a better school now, kids are smarter. I'm not so sure about that. I think kids have always been pretty smart here. I think that it's just drawing from more communities in a really good way. So, I know the admissions folks would be able to say it more accurately, but I believe we pull from over 100 different communities and towns now.
Wow.
And I bet the number was half that 25 years ago. Maybe it was 40 towns, 45, which was big at the time, but I think our reach is just so much greater now. So you have just kids from all over the state, and they're in turn from all over the world, because New Jersey is such a great kind of magnet for talent from all over the world.
What was it like being a twin and having them be your training partner them being with you throughout your school years here?
I think it was great at times and challenging at times. So it was great because I had somebody to complain to and with. He also was unhappy initially. And so that was, we were kind of comrades in arms there, trying to, revolt against our parents. He's much more of a risk taker than I am. So it was actually so for instance, he's a more talented runner than I am, but it wasn't until sophomore year that he even ran track. So 7th, 8th, 9th grade, he played football, baseball, tennis. He may even have tried some other sports, but so he really kind of surveyed the landscape, whereas I was doing cross country and track from 7th grade on. As a result of doing those other sports, he ended up meeting the kids who would become our best friends. So in a way, he would bring a friend home who was on the football team with him, or baseball, or tennis, and then I would get to interact with that student, and then maybe become friends with him. And so I got to kind of see the value of not being homogeneous in your pursuits and in your thinking. And I was lucky in that way that I had a twin who was a risk taker. And I certainly see that now, that I think the biggest flaw that upper school students and parents kind of embody is just being a research kid, or just being a lacrosse player, or a theater kid, that they end up missing a huge segment of the population. And then it was difficult because he was like a head taller than I was, and he looked like my older brother, like my considerably older brother. So that was embarrassing. I got over that, but it was embarrassing.
What's it like coaching cross country now as opposed to being an athlete for Pingree?
I think it's great. I mean, I really, I feel like cross country draws a unique kind of athlete, because it's never going to be a marquee sport.
Right.
The spectators don't even get to watch you for sometimes 80% of a race. So it's not viewer friendly. It's not a kind of headline grabbing sport. But I think as a result, it attracts, thoughtful student athletes who aren't necessarily interested in grabbing headlines, who are accustomed to working really hard outside of the limelight. And I like those, I value those characteristics. I think that a lot of what people do now, they do if there's going to be an immediate reward and sense of recognition. And I don't know that creates great people or team members or community members or friends. So I'm I like the student group and the peer group, even the coaches, the people who are drawn to the sport, I think tend to be people I like to be around. For the reasons right. I mentioned.
Can you talk about the honor code back when you were a student at Pingree?
Sure. I don't know that I gave it much thought when I was a student, to be honest. I remember signing the honor code. Our headmaster at the time, John Hanley, used to deliver 1 or 2 speeches a year on the honor code, and I do remember those. So I feel like there was a conversation around honor, and so when I went off to college, the school I attended had an honor code. And at that point, I remember kind of being aware of it and maybe paying attention to my behavior a little bit more as a result. So I feel like the background here couldn't have hurt. I think that my background exposure here to the honor code probably made me more receptive to conversations about the honor code as an undergraduate. Certainly when I started working, so when I was 22 onward, and in schools as a teacher, I was very aware of the honor code. And again, a little bit of chicken and the egg. I don't know that I would have been as interested in things like why students make the choices they make. Why is cheating so prevalent? What are the pressures? I don't know that I would have been as interested in that or aware of that in my 20s had I not gone to Pingree. I think at this point I would have caught up, but I do think I was a little bit more sensitive and aware early on to just those sorts of pressures and competing forces on students.
What are some of the differences between how the honor code is perceived and also discussed at Pingree now and in comparison to before?
That's a good question. I think at times, I'm really impressed with our honor board. And I don't know, to be honest, if we had an honor board back when I was a student. I certainly don't remember being aware of it. I know we had one in college, and I had a Pingree classmate I went to college with who was part of that honor board. So that would be a historical question, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I'm impressed with the work that they do, and I feel like that's a great way to start having conversations with freshmen and kind of cross-grade conversations about what the honor code means. I do feel like there are an awful lot of pressures that are more pronounced, outside pressures now on students that really minimize the honor code. So, for instance, I think there's a kind of win-at-all-cost mentality in the United States right now that filters down to college admissions, to grades, to jobs and internships. And I think that Pingree, in some ways, is trying to resist that. And it's particularly families that come to us in the 9th grade who haven't been here since middle school or the lower school, haven't had to think about or sign an honor code or discuss it in any way. I think that could be a kind of a culture shock. And I think that the honor code is maybe more prevalent now. I don't know if it's more adhered to or respected. So I think it's more visible, but I think the pressures not to conform to the honor code, to take shortcuts, has probably quadrupled since I was a student. I think the sense of internal competition, and again the idea that I'm paying this tuition, so I'm owed this grade, this college outcome. It's probably, and that's my guessing. It's anecdotal, but I think there's a lot of that goes on that's counterproductive, and so it's almost like I think the honor code, in some senses, it's out of fashion. Culturally, it's like an artifact, and maybe we'll come back to it being in fashion in the larger area. But I think questions about making a community stronger, as opposed to how do I, as an individual, accomplish more. I think there's some real tension there, and I do think that's something that Pingree hasn't struggled with, but it's kind of a fascinating challenge. Like, how do you promote individual excellence? How do you foster a healthy sense of competition, but also reinforce the importance of teamwork, community, mutual sacrifice, delayed gratification? That's a tough thing for a 15-year-old to process. I think it's a tough thing for a parent who's paying that tuition to process. It sounds great, but I think in practice, in reality, it's difficult.
Do you have any advice for anyone that may be struggling with their balance between excellence and honor? I think what helps me is not to think so much of the wording of the honor code, which I could not
repeat verbatim. But I do think that I have examples of classmates and teachers from my days as a student who I think acted honorably. And I try to remember their example. And I've I'm fortunate that I have no shortage of coaches and teachers and classmates whose behavior then and now, if they're still alive, I feel like they embody the honor code. So I think, reflecting on what those people that you respect have done, how they lead their life, how they conduct themselves, I think that could be incredibly useful, as opposed to kind of memorizing a statement or signing a pledge. I think we all have been impressed with how friends or colleagues have handled a stressful moment, or a kind of difficult decision, and I don't know how much having that framework of the honor code allowed them to make that right decision, but I do know that I've thought more about how do you make an honorable, tough decision? Mm-hmm. What does that look like? And kind of drawing off of actual examples has been really helpful for me. And I guess two examples, recent examples of Pingree classmates, things that have just impressed me, people who I think exhibited real thoughtful character and good judgment. Andrew Goldstein, who's a class of 92 and works in, let me get his actual title. He works for the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Manhattan office, and he's the chief of the Public Corruption Unit. And he delivered the closing argument in the case against Sheldon Silver, who I believe was the Speaker of the House in the New York Senate. And he delivered a 4-hour closing argument. But watching not only that trial unfold and the way he handled that, but watching, observing the decisions he's made career-wise, forsaking a very lucrative kind of private practice to do public corruption work. He has 2 children, lives in New York City, kind of very expensive lifestyle, and yet, he and his wife both. His wife works for a nonprofit, and he works for the city, for the people of New York. That to me is a great example of how do you, in your career, mm-hmm. maybe embody the honor code. And then there's another Pingree class of 90 or 91, a judge out in California, and I'm blanking on her name, but she was one of the 3 judges who overturned the Trump travel ban. Again, somebody who, having read her bio, I believe kind of turned down a kind of lucrative private practice to enter the public sector. And not that everybody needs to do that or should. I think you need to be, you need to have a certain temperament. But I like that. I took a real sense of pride, and I'm curious to maybe ask those 2 individuals, mm-hmm. how did Pingree shape that decision, if at all? But again, kind of looking at the enormous public pressure, political pressure that they were under, financial career pressure, and seeing them in very thoughtful, poised ways make good decisions is really heartening. Mm-hmm. I kind of find I derive a lot of strength from that, from those contemporary examples.
How does the honor code manifest itself in your Pingree day-to-day life now?
It's a good question. I think I try. I think I am very aware of kind of being part of a community, and I think that that's always been important to me, kind of having relationships with my colleagues, with the families and students that I'm working with, So I think I'm even though my job is very outcome oriented, I think I've changed over the years my view of what that outcome is, and I think I've seen just as I've gotten older that a college outcome doesn't immunize you from hardship down the road, from illness. It doesn't guarantee anything other than a warm bed in September. And so I think looking at the larger outcomes, kind of what defines happiness that's maybe less fleeting than an acceptance. And I think for me, happiness is derived by kind of long-term friendships, a kind of shared sense of struggle and accomplishment. So, for instance, kind of working with peers that I really respect, keeping in touch with families and students, and watching how students' goals evolve over time. I think that Pingree has always had been in a unique position where alums come back, and I was able to witness as a student these kind of long-standing relationships between faculty and students, and how, and I don't know what role the honor code played in that, but I do think having an honor code can create a healthy sense of community and, again, shared purpose and shared responsibility. And I definitely feel an obligation to somehow contribute to that, to maybe be a kind of stable presence for students and families in an emotional time, not to have a kind of wavering, not to deliver a kind of wavering message, a win-at-all-cost message, not to be mercenary in my own approach to college outcomes. I think that if there's a way in which that can help parents and students be more thoughtful, maybe more cognizant of the opportunities that they're given, then I guess that's how I define success. I don't know if I answered the question. That was a very rambling answer. I don't know. You may have to do some editing.
I might have to. I'm not sure if you answered the question, but that's quite all right.
I don't even remember what the question was.
That's okay. Can you talk about your transition moving from Pingree High School to your college life?
Sure. I think it was, in some ways, it was a pretty easy transition, because I feel like I knew how to juggle responsibilities here. I was pretty organized. I feel like I was very invested and took a real sense of pride in my work. I was very comfortable meeting with professors and asking follow-up questions of them after class, and I definitely attribute that to Pingree. The accessibility of the teachers from 9th grade on, having academic advisors who, some of them coached me, some of them taught me, but who took an interest in my development. I felt like I had something worthwhile to add to a conversation in class, and I was invested in becoming a better student. And so I think that Pingree absolutely shaped my approach in college, which then shaped my outcome. I think that career-wise, Pingree, more than anything else, led me back into education. I thought I was going to go to law school and was going to do law, was going to maybe major in political science, and ended up switching to English late in sophomore year, but got into teaching as a result of, I think, the several teachers I had here who, in my mind, clearly could have been teaching at the college level, clearly could have been making an awful lot of money in jobs non-education related, and yet chose to be at Pingree. So there was a sense of kind of value to being in education that I picked up being a student here. And again, feel very lucky that, who knows what direction my life would have taken. But I think that, Pingree impacted where I went to college, the way I thought about and even approached my freshman year classes and my senior year ones, and then absolutely impacted my choice of career. I reached out to Pingree teachers when I was thinking about applying to graduate school, when I was thinking about interviewing for teaching positions, when I was thinking about becoming an English major. I mean, every step of the way I had 3 or 4 faculty that I counted on as mentors, which is really remarkable. Again, just lucky, maybe coincidence and timing, but I don't think so, because I see students doing that now with faculty.
Right.
So I think that that's something that I probably observed as a freshman through senior here and felt comfortable doing when I was then a freshman through senior in college.
What were some of the career choices that you had to make through your years, and maybe what led you back to Pingree and becoming director of college admissions?
I think a big one was whether I wanted to work in public school or private school. The financial opportunities are greater in public school. There are other trade-offs, but Summit has a great public school system, and I was teaching at Oak Knoll for 10 years, and I had Summit High School right down the road,
right.
and they had a great English department at the time in the 90s. And so I think one of the things I wrestled with was kind of the purpose and value of a private school education. There is something, because of the tuition, that is kind of elitist or exclusive about attending a private school and working at a private school. And there's something that is kind of necessary about having a really strong, accessible public school system in this country. And so I had to really wrestle with kind of what I wanted to get out of teaching, what I thought my strengths and weaknesses were as a teacher, and then what community could I most impact. And I think that's where I was really looking for schools that shared Pingree's kind of sense of purpose. It wasn't just a kind of factory for highly competitive colleges and high-level jobs. I think that there was that sense of community built in. So I was looking for private schools that shared that. And then I was looking for kind of places where I could have small class sizes and really get to know the students and families I was working with. And unfortunately, at a lot of the public schools I looked at, the classes were 20 to 30 students large as opposed to 10 to 15. And I just knew that one of my strengths was connecting with students. Once those classes reached 18 plus, classroom management itself became an issue. And I just didn't, I didn't know if I could handle the triage that results. And I think it takes a really talented teacher to do that. And I didn't know, to be honest, if that was one of my talents, is turning around 150 English papers as opposed to 60, and maintaining the same level of enthusiasm 5, 10, 15 years in, given that sort of workload and responsibility.
What do you seek to accomplish with your ethical dilemma class?
I think it's evolved over the years. I think one major goal of mine is to, I think, expose students to different kinds of texts. So it started, 10 years ago or 8 years ago with deciding to pick a work of kind of fiction, a work of nonfiction, a play, a collection of short stories. So exposing students to different genres, because I felt like, rightly or wrongly, or accurately or inaccurately, that students weren't reading as much, that they weren't exposed to as many different types of literature. So students were maybe saying, "Oh, I don't like plays," or that's for the theater kids, or I don't do nonfiction, or I only do fiction when it's required, but I don't actually like it, and forget about short story collections. I don't think students knew those existed, and poetry is a whole other. So I've sometimes worked in even poetry collections. So I think it started off as trying to expose them to different kinds of literature that all revolved around this idea of conflict and community? How do we resolve conflict internally? How do conflicts bring a community together and fragment a community? And that community could be a family, could be a marriage, it could be a town. And I think over the years, then that's evolved to try and include even more types of text. So articles, podcasts, movies, documentaries, getting students maybe to think about and read the texts that are all around them and become better consumers of kind of texts. And so bringing in current events even, trying to make the curriculum relevant, kind of immediately relevant to them, while not making it a class on public policy, for instance. I think getting them to be maybe more thoughtful, responsible, ethical kind of consumers in every sense of the word. And I think one of the ways you can do that is by knowing how to really analyze behavior and motivations, and studying characters is a great way to kind of see ourselves and kind of examine our own kind of failures, kind of ethical failures, and do it in a kind of a safe way where it's somebody else is making the mistake. We get to kind of analyze it and maybe look at the consequences. But so I think the class is kind of a wonderful opportunity to really just look at kind of conflict and what produces it, what resolves it. And I'm lucky that I've been given a lot of kind of latitude in creating a course and changing it year to year to kind of fit student tastes and to fit the current climate.
What are some of your favorite pieces, books, movies, podcasts, etc., that are really interesting to you that have come up recently?
I love one that we did not do this year, but that I may bring back next year, is a Russell Banks novel called The Sweet Hereafter. And there's a great film adaptation by Adam Agoyan, also called The Sweet Hereafter. And it deals with a school bus accident in upstate New York that injures a number of students, claims the lives of many students, and kind of the novel deals with the aftermath of that. So the accident happens very early on. The book actually begins, the accident has already happened. The lawyers have started descending. The lawsuits have begun, and the finger pointing and blaming. And it's a character study and a kind of a community study. And I really love the way that it presents people in a stressful situation and then examines the kind of right and wrong decisions that they make. And the movie really does change the book in a lot of cool ways that it kind of allows the students to see the story from a whole other perspective. And so that's been just a successful work over the years to study. Killings, a short story by Andre Dubus, which was also made into a great film called In the Bedroom a number of years ago, gets at issues like kind of revenge and justice and even gun control and gun violence, which has been just fun to teach over the years and get students to explore capital punishment and just crime and punishment in the United States and how we approach it.
So, Coach, I'm just about done with all of my questions. Are there any major takeaways, tips, advice that you would like to give to anyone listening?
No, I think I'd be curious to see, I'd be curious to kind of like turn the microphone around and almost ask you as an honor board member and as a student here, kind of how you feel the honor board is, or the honor code is viewed at Pingree, and what are the internal and external pressures that stretch the honor code or diminish it or make it stronger and make it more prominent? Do you feel like students are making ethical decisions? Do you feel like the adults in the community are modeling good or bad behavior? Are we having the same conversations as students? Are we providing the sort of modeling and the behavior that I kind of referenced earlier?
Right.
The examples that students can look at and point to and say, okay, that's the way I want to conduct my life. Those are the kinds of choices I want to be strong enough to make. And that would, to me, would be a really interesting, for me, stressful conversation, because I would be very invested in the outcome and in the answers. But
do I answer or?
Sure, if it's time. Yeah, absolutely.
I have all the time in the world. Technically 22 minutes, but
we'll give it a couple more.
Couple more. I mean, for me personally, I have been on the honor board since my freshman year, so I guess my experience at Pingree has been a bit different. Even though I came as a freshman, I've been thrown, quote unquote, into a position of what I would consider respect and maybe some, I don't know if approach is a correct word, but there is a stigma that surrounds the honor board that we've been trying to deal with, but I'm not sure if trying to pull the curtain away and then just showing all the gears at work is necessarily the right thing we need for the community. I'm sure that on a need-to-know basis, people ask us, what's the hearing process like? What's it like being on an honor board hearing? What are your meetings like? I'm sure telling the community, hey, this is how it works is fine. But at the same time, that may just detract from the other part of what being on the honor board means. Trying to lead by the honor code. As you said earlier, being a model for students. I know even though I was an impressionable freshman on the honor board, I had a bunch of seniors who I looked up to really highly, and other upperclassmen. And some of them didn't always make the right choices, I guess you could say. But I feel like, in a way, it's kind of cherry picking. But to just let one specific thing that they do or a choice that they make at one instance kind of taint the entire picture is myopic in its own way. And I think it's important to recognize that I guess no one is perfect, everyone is imperfect in their own little way. And that there's still that they can still be wonderful people, and that they're still wonderful people to meet. And sometimes I feel like when we want to try and host a discussion about the honor code, it's not always the best received, sometimes it feels like a drag. Sometimes it feels like administration pushing things on us. And it's a tough balance. I was talking to Mr. Ross about it yesterday actually, and there's kind of a positive peer pressure for some things that I don't think the honor board can necessarily foster to its fullest, and that it's something that students have to undertake. And how we can accomplish that, I think, kind of surpasses the purview of the honor board. And that's something that my friends or even kids at the school I don't talk to have to undertake. And how we can get that started is a very, very tough question that I'm not necessarily sure how to answer. But that's my 2 cents on things.
And that kind of brings into relief kind of the question you asked earlier about ethical dilemma. I think that's one of the reasons I like teaching it, is I feel like we get to talk about the honor code without talking about the honor code. So it's almost like cheating, or I can sneak up on students, and they may not even know that they've thought about honor code issues,
Right.
and yet, like that's what we've been discussing, and just under a different name,
Mm-hmm.
or just using literature instead of a document that they may think is stale or irrelevant. And it's one of the reasons I think I kind of want to keep teaching the class,
Mm-hmm.
whatever they call it. I feel like that's one of the great things about teaching English is it's dealing with kind of real life situations, stress and conflict, and compromise and ambition and success, and why do we make the choices that we make, and what are the consequences for us and for the people around us. And that has such great political ramifications,
Mm-hmm.
and cultural and familial. So it's I do feel like the humanities are in kind of a unique position
Mm-hmm.
at Pingree and elsewhere to kind of further a conversation around things like the honor code, and we can call it Shakespeare,
Mm-hmm.
madness in literature, whatever, history of philosophy.
Right.
We can call it whatever we want, but if we're dealing with kind of human beings and human behavior, it'll come back to questions of kind of honors and value and right and wrong.
Yeah.
So cool.
All right.
Thanks a lot. I hope I gave you some
Definitely.
useful material.
Definitely.
Yeah. I don't know. You'll have to let me listen to the finished product.
Definitely. Mr./Coach Tim Lear, Pingree class of 92, Director of Admissions. Coach Lear, thank you so much.
Great. You're welcome. Thank you.